everyone a couple of seconds to come in. Okay. So welcome to today's webinar. This afternoon, we are going to be addressing domestic abuse, adverse childhood experiences in the context of intergenerational trauma. We have Daisy here from For Baby's Sake, who will be helping me navigating through the slides for all of us, and also responding to any of the chat and your questions in the Q&A section, preparing them for later on when we're able to go through them all with you. Next slide, please. So I'm your host for today. My name is Leah Lewin, the perinatal specialist. I'm an educator and consultant for various charities and organisations, and you can find me at the Perinatal Specialist or via email, leah@theperinatalspecialist.com. Thank you. So the main objectives for today are to have some really thought-provoking and engaging conversations as we start to explore the intersections and nuance of the transmission of ACEs and domestic abuse, domestic violence, and intergenerational trauma. So the key objectives are understanding what intergenerational trauma is and the various forms, what domestic abuse versus domestic violence is, what are ACEs and how are they defined, what do we already know about each of these things, and what role do we play in the elimination of trauma. We're also going to look at, again, how these intersect with one another. Thank you, Daisy. So we'll start, the first 5 minutes will be a few introductions. I will then be giving an overview of today's topics. I'll then be handing over to Rose, who is also from For Baby's Sake, and Julie Body from White Ribbon Alliance, followed by a Q&A to finish. As I said, if you do have any questions as they pop up throughout, then please do pop them in the Q&A section or the chat box, and we will do our best to get to as many of those as possible. So the first question, what is intergenerational trauma? So intergenerational trauma is also known as transgenerational trauma, which refers to where trauma is experienced by one generation and can then be affecting the next, either psychologically or emotionally, and it impacts the health of subsequent generations. So this concept is rooted in an understanding that the effects of trauma can transcend the individual directly affected and then manifest in their descendants, their grandchildren, their grandchildren's children, etc., through a variety of different mechanisms. Historical events such as things like war, famine, the Holocaust, the enslavement of African and Caribbean people, the experiences of Indigenous people being oppressed, and colonialism, and other instances of mass violence and oppression have been studied for their intergenerational impacts. Families and communities that are affected by these events are always disproportionately likely to experience higher rates of mental health disorders, stress-related illnesses, and struggle with various forms of social functioning and integration. So it's really important that we understand intergenerational trauma and what it involves. And we can do that by looking at the complex interconnections between the biological and environmental factors. Addressing this trauma requires a really multifaceted approach, including mental health interventions, social support systems, and community-based healing practices. There is significant research on the epigenetics and the transmission of intergenerational trauma, which indicate that trauma experiences can lead to changes in the genes of individuals and subsequent generations. The transmission of this is, there are 3 factors, so psychological, biological, and social. So when we talk about the transmission and we're talking about it psychologically, the parents or grandparents who've experienced significant trauma may exhibit behaviors and emotional responses that are shaped by their own experiences. And that can influence their parenting styles, their attachment patterns, emotional availability, and their philosophical views and beliefs. When we look at this from a social perspective, children and the grandchildren can then inherit the effects of trauma through their family dynamics, through cultural practices, and shared narratives within the family. And also biologically, emerging research is showing in this area that epigenetics suggests that trauma can leave a biochemical mark on people's genes, which is then handed down through DNA. Thank you, Daisy. So the next area is, what is domestic abuse? And what's the difference between domestic abuse and domestic violence? So domestic abuse is the broader term, which encompasses all forms of maltreatment and abuse by one person against another when they have either a family or intimate relationship. And that can be, again, psychological, emotional, financial, sexual, or even physical abuse. So it's not just one form of abuse, whereas domestic violence is a form of domestic abuse that is specifically violent. It's violence that's committed. So, for example, hitting, slapping, punching, kicking, using weapons to inflict harm, or any form of physical aggression. But that's just to distinguish the key differences, because while all domestic violence is domestic abuse, not all domestic abuse is violent. And it's important to really recognize the difference between the two. Thank you, Daisy. And the third element of today's conversations is around adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs. And that refers to potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood, so between the ages of 0 to 17 years, which can then significantly impact on a child's physical and mental health throughout their lifespan. And this continues into adulthood. So the concept of ACEs was initially developed in a landmark study conducted by the Center of Disease Control back in the 1990s. And this study identified a strong relationship between the exposure to early adversity and a range of health and social problems across the lifespan of that individual. And they can include things like abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, so having a relative incarcerated or someone with mental illness, domestic violence, and even things like separation and divorce of parents. So the intersection of domestic abuse, adverse childhood experiences, and intergenerational trauma presents a really complex and very painful cycle that just continues to perpetuate trauma across multiple generations. And this cyclical pattern can then have really profound and enduring effects on individuals. Next slide, please, Daisy. So the intergenerational trauma, understanding the foundation of this and how it refers to trauma that's passed down from one generation to the next is really, really key when we talk about having trauma-informed care. But this can occur when the effects of trauma are not fully resolved in one generation, which then leads to behavioral patterns and emotional responses and social dynamics that influence the upbringing and the environment of subsequent generations. Common mechanisms for transmission of this include their parenting practices, family interactions, socioeconomic factors, and other elements that can perpetuate stress with limited access to supportive resources like today's webinar and the work that the charities that you'll hear from today are doing in this area. Excuse me. So things we can do, several pathways, modeling behavior, allowing vulnerability or acknowledging the vulnerability to abuse, and how we can work as a collective to ensure that we're breaking these cyclical traumas, and emotional regulation are all really, really important. The cyclical nature of the trauma. So when children affected by ACEs grow into adults without any form of therapeutic intervention or supportive relationships, they're more likely to then continue to perpetuate patterns of abuse and trauma, therefore increasing the likelihood that their own children will also experience ACEs. And this is a cycle that not only affects the direct family, but also broader social impacts. So we want to break those cycles, which is what the learning around today is about. Therapeutic support, education and awareness, community and social support, and equally as important is things like policy intervention. So understanding and addressing all of these intersections of domestic abuse, ACEs, intergenerational trauma is really crucial for the healing and preventing the continuation of these cycles. I've put together a few reference materials if they're of interest, which will come up. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Daisy. But next we have two wonderful speakers that can delve into these topics a bit further, sharing examples of the manifestation and the importance of the work of organisations such as For Baby's Sake and White Ribbon Alliance. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome the first speaker. We have Rose Okoye. Please forgive me if I pronounced that incorrectly, I should have asked, who is a therapeutic practitioner from For Baby's Sake. For Baby's Sake is a UK-wide charity that's supporting families in breaking the cycle of domestic abuse and giving babies the best start in life. I'll hand over to you now, Rose.
Thank you. Thanks, Leah, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining. Yes, I don't need to give any more to my introduction. So you can go on to the next slide. Yes, so when we're looking at the scale of domestic abuse in the UK, people are often surprised around the statistics of domestic abuse in pregnancy and at birth. But looking through and having a read of the statistics yourself, as you can see on the screen, you can see why we do the work that we do. At For Baby's Sake, we work with families and follow the baby's timeline from pregnancy up to 2 years, focusing on ending those cycles of abuse and creating the best and safest environments for families. So we can go on to the next slide. Thank you, Daisy. So how we work. So we take a holistic approach, supporting the entire family unit. Our work centers on helping parents who aim to co-parent, often driven by the wish to give their child a better upbringing than they've experienced themselves. This includes working with both individuals impacted by and those who exhibit abusive behaviors. So safety is our priority. Each parent is assigned a separate therapeutic practitioner to maintain confidentiality and reduce risk. As practitioners, we collaborate closely with in-group case management. We receive clinical supervision, and most referrals come from children's social care, but we also accept self-referrals, ensuring contact with local support services. Can go on to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so the focus on the first 2 years, it can be key to focus on the first 2 years, especially when we're looking at ACEs, to help the parents to start to acknowledge and question, what's helpful or unhelpful in their own childhoods, and how they can use that to help create the best childhood they can for their children. Looking on the slide, 30% of domestic abuse begins in pregnancy. So the interventions at this stage can prevent years of abuse and harm. So really catching what that has, so really catching those ACEs early on and helping the parents kind of look through and know what's going on for them can really help to motivate and help to protect and care for the baby and make those changes that they need to do. So we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. I'm just going to play a video of our work.
The first few years are so important. Who you are as a person is set up in those first few years.
Both my mum and dad probably had their own challenges.
Okay, thank you, Daisy. I think we can move on to the next slide.
Bear with me, Rose. I'm having a technical difficulty and I can't see the screen, so I'm going to have to stop sharing and start sharing again.
Okay, no worries.
1 second.
I just saw a question about the video being on our website. I believe it is, and it's on YouTube as well.
That's right. Yeah, I'll pop the link in the chat in just a second.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. So thank you all for your really nice feedback on the video. I can see that coming through. So yeah, as the video kind of shows, and what I've been speaking about is our trauma-informed approach. So we definitely come from a trauma-informed lens, which helps us to work with parents to reflect on their own childhood experiences and how this feeds into their own parenting and other relationships. It's really key that we do this in a non-judgmental way. We're able to give them a confidential, safe space to really build that trust in order to go into what they have experienced. As you can imagine, that's very difficult to go into those conversations, but if they have that safe space to start to unpick what's happening, and what's going on for them, as Leah said before, that's kind of the ground to start that healing, to have that safe space and know that that safe space is possible, to start breaking those unhealthy patterns. So we can go to the next slide, Daisy, please. Thank you. So like I was saying, nothing that cannot be spoken. So looking at the links of what they've experienced and the different emotions and giving them the space to feel validated and heard, whilst also challenging what may not be the healthiest patterns that they may have learned. And looking at unresolved traumas can give space to start to explore the impact and process emotions that they may have not been able to before. Because as we all know, growing up, especially in traumatic environments, you won't have that safe space to start to explore or really think about what's happening because you are in that survival, fight or flight mode, which I'll go into a little bit more later on. Next slide, please. Thank you. So yes, so how we look at ACEs and discuss them helps parents to start to unpick certain responses. So we have certain trauma insight tools, such as building that connection, that empathy and understanding helps to build that safe space. So working on that emotional regulation and healing once we kind of know those certain trigger points, and kind of certain histories behind what may have started those unhealthy processes. We can go on to the next slide, which is the video around that. Thank you. Thank you. So I think you can see on the screen now the different tools and kind of the questions behind breaking those cycles. And I think it's important to take the time, to ask those questions, because it may be for the first time, that parents have had that space or the capacity to think about why. Like I said, often when we're in that survival kind of fight or flight mode, we don't have, the time to really take that space and think about the why, which then leads on to how certain elements of intergenerational traumas can be passed on, and the links to self-esteem, low self-esteem or unhealthy coping mechanisms. Asking the questions and the whys really helps parents and just people in general to really start to unpick what is going on for them. And if they want to, start to make some changes, what do they want to create as a healthier environment? It's really helpful to create that space to do that. We can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So a bit more around intergenerational trauma. So I spoke about the fight or flight, living to survive versus living to thrive. I can speak of my own personal experiences from a Nigerian British background. I could see where there were certain priorities my mum placed in order to succeed in a new country when she moved to the UK, and feeling racism, having no choice to survive in hostile environments. But it can often be a coping mechanism to minimize or be hyper resilient to certain experience, which can lead to focusing on surviving versus thriving, especially emotionally. So it's good to have that in mind when we are kind of doing the work to unpick certain traumas and certain things that come from intergenerational trauma, as well as things that are kind of a wider effect in systems, so systematic racism, class, things that really have a play not only in households but in the wider society as well. And I'm just curious to know if anybody has had any or could share any problematic labels or pressures, personal or professional, whatever you're comfortable with, in the chat box that you may have feel like you faced or has kind of been passed down. It'll be interesting to have that conversation as well. Because I know definitely kind of growing up myself, I've had certain labels and certain things put on myself, microaggressions, such as where you really from and things like that. Or I used to work in the prison service, being assumed that I was visiting instead of working. So things like that. Yeah, strong Black woman I can see in the chat, definitely. Yes. Yeah. So all of these assumptions that put a lot of pressure on people to live up to into a certain degree or play into a certain role as well. High maintenance, yes. Yeah. So I think we've all had those experiences that can come into play, and having to adjust to different cultures and attitudes as well, and shifts in class as well with families and people that kind of move into different countries and different places can also be challenges that are passed on to other generations as well. Yeah, stay small, lazy, okay. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that are placed on us. And I think when we're working with families, it's really important to listen and hear what those labels are and to start to unpick them, because as we all know, as labels start to be applied to us, we start to believe them. We stop questioning them and thinking that, especially as children, we usually take on those labels. Yes, thank you everyone for your input. Yes. And I guess we'll go into them in more depth a bit later. Okay, so thank you, Daisy, for the next slide. We explore emotional adverse childhood experiences as well as physical and verbal. So this includes experiences that might be in the household, such as domestic violence, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, incarceration, experiences in the community, such as bullying, racism, discrimination, community violence, as well as poverty and exposure to war. So quite a lot of areas we cover to make sure we're trying to capture everything. But just like with any kind of experience, we can't, capture them all. And it's important to be open to all the experiences that people bring, and the impact of, for example, other deeper, wider levels such as racism and colorism have, and what effects that the level of othering can have in everyday life, and in interactions as well. And then looking at assumptions being made around language or understanding. I think that was even mentioned in the chat as well. As well as intersectionality, so different layers of experiences as well. And again, I'm just wondering if we can have a little interaction in the chat around what do you feel the impact would be on intersectionality on ACEs? So, for example, race on top of gender, what impact do you feel like that would add when it comes to ACEs? Or we can take our time to go through that because I know it's quite a complex question. And then we can go on to our last slide. Yes, lack of self-confidence. So that really feeds into the self-esteem on a double, triple layer when we're looking at. Yes. Yes, I'm hoping everyone can see the chat because it's amazing answers that are coming through. But definitely, so we can see how complex it is when it comes to ACEs. It's more than just one layer, and that's why I guess, especially with the work that we do having the 2 years, we really get a chance to delve into those things and really have the space. But even just for a moment to have that space for someone to be listened and understood, and for assumptions not to be made, I think it's really, really important. Okay. All right, if we can go into the last slide. So how do we work with what we know? So like you've all been doing I can see from your responses, remaining curious and open, even if there are elements we've not heard or experienced ourselves, to be able to listen and accept someone else's lived experience is key. And I can definitely see the empathy coming through from all of your responses there. And looking at scripts. So we have these things called scripts, which it's pretty much beliefs that are often taken on from childhood that frame our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. I think Leah touched on it a little bit as well. And using the tool that we call keep it, chuck it, check it, to really take the time to, that's what we kind of call taking the time to really dissect and look at and unpick what those scripts are. Usually with older generations, they didn't have the time, the space, the capacity to really take the time to unpick why. So having that gift of really trying to go into and reflect on, do certain scripts need to be passed on? Do certain things need to be, certain responses to trauma need to be passed on? What can be the difference? What can I change in my response to certain things? It's not to minimize or take away the traumas that have been experienced. It's still very much there, but helping to process and unpick the why. And if there is a different way to process those traumas. So taking the time to see if it explores also past personal scripts, or is it linked to a wider society as well? It may take work to understand more around, what can happen around the checking it, keeping it, and chucking it, what that might look like, which requires patience and time to work through certain things with people, and to help the healing and the unlearning happen. And also not to kind of strip or take away everything, but what else can we put in place to help to rebuild and to promote that healing as well for the best and safest environment for families and for babies especially. So yeah, that's the end of my little segment. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Rose. That was Absolutely brilliant. And thank you to everyone that got involved in the chat. I think there are some really great key messages in what you said there. Identifying that people are very nuanced and that every person is really multifaceted. And when you put all of the intersections of things like trauma, the intergenerational trauma and ACEs and domestic abuse, it's so important that we break the cycle so that we can have equity. And it's not even just within families, but also within our communities and socially. Referring back to what you said, Rose, about the importance of therapeutic support. And it just highlights the importance of the work that you're doing with individuals, but also with the community on a whole, when you're providing so much support, information, and resources for both the individuals and the professionals alike. So thank you very much. That was wonderful. Now moving on to our next speaker, we have Julie Boddy, the Movement Director from White Ribbon Alliance. White Ribbon is an independent national charity working in alliance with other charities and organisations globally to improve policy, programme and practice by utilising a human rights framework in sexual and reproductive health care and rights. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I am here today to talk to you about intergenerational trauma, but from the lens of descendants of the oppressors. Now, before I begin, I want to just give a quick content warning. I am going to touch on topics of domestic abuse, colonialism, enslavement, and systemic oppression. And this may emotionally activate some of you in a negative way. Please just mute me, walk away. If I don't intend, my intention is not to hurt anybody with what I have to say, but obviously impact matters more than intent. Additionally, I would like to request that other people who are racialized as white people like myself, if you feel discomfort in the things that I'm about to say, if you feel uneasy or angry by the things that I'm going to cover here, could you please sit with that discomfort, and rather than bringing it up in the chat where it could harm people who are in the chat that are Black, Brown, Indigenous, or other people of color, and you can come to me to discuss these things separately. It's not for us to bring our discomfort and anger over our ancestors' past up in these safe spaces. So those are just my two warnings. Next slide, please. So this is me. This is little me on the left, around the time that my world was shattered by domestic violence and lots of ACEs. And there is a wholer, more healed version of myself there on the right. I'm the movement director at White Ribbon. If you want to speak with me, you can reach me at julie@whiteribbonalliance.org.uk. So I am here, I'm a bit nervous. Lost my notes, sorry. So I'm here to talk about the intergenerational trauma, but from a oppressed person's perspective, or oppressor's perspective. Now, when I mean that, I think it's important that we have a common definition. So people who are descendants of of colonizers like myself, we carry generational trauma, just like people who are descendants of enslaved individuals or people who've been persecuted for religious reasons. It's a personal topic for me, and it's also really important to me as someone who works in the SRHR space. So my goal today is to share not only how this trauma gets passed down within the generations of people who've oppressed others, but also how I personally have recognized it in myself and made efforts to heal both the oppressor intergenerational trauma that I carry, but also the trauma I carry from the domestic abuse and ACEs that I suffered. And I can also provide some pragmatic steps for those of you who are in the same position as myself to heal and do less harm going forward. So let's start with the concept of oppressor generational trauma. So this is the trauma that's passed down through families who have historically benefited from privilege, and specifically white privilege, class privilege, religious privilege. And that can be through intergenerational wealth, inherited power, or just systemic biases that favor certain phenotypes or nationalities. And for descendants of oppressors like myself, this trauma is very different than the trauma experienced by those who were enslaved or exploited by my ancestors. But it's still deeply harmful to our families and to us as individuals today. And it comes from the violent acts and systemic oppression that our ancestors enacted. And at the time, they were seen as normal or legal or socially acceptable. And our family members passed those attitudes down to us to this day. And while we might not be the same as our parents or our grandparents or great-great-great-granddads are, we still carry those biases and that racism with us, and the trauma that we inflicted on others as a collective group of oppressors affects the world as we navigate it today, and the people that we love, care for, and work for and work with. Sorry, I'm very nervous about this. This is something I talk deeply with my friends, and Leah and I've talked about it many times. This is the first time I've talked about it to so many people. So the next slide, please.
Great.
Towards violence, control, and maintaining power structures, they become embedded in family dynamics and societal expectations. So this creates a cycle where those who hold privilege, we perpetuate harm, but we also experience the emotional consequences of that privilege, such as guilt, shame, or a full disconnection from empathy. And you see this passed down in families where enacting violence on enslaved people or on women or impoverished people going back 200 years comes out in your family, inflicting violence upon yourself or you on your children. Oppressor generational trauma is part of a legacy of violence, control, and exploitation, and facing the reality of what our ancestors did is absolutely integral to the healing of ourselves and all the other people that we interact with in our lives. If we don't do this, if we don't understand how this history continues to shape our behavior today, whether it's through racism, privilege, or inherited patterns of harm, everyone is going to continue to suffer. It's white people's job to address the generational trauma that has come down through our family trees so that we can tear down the systems that are oppressing other people because of their skin color, their religion, or their nationality. So on the screen here, you'll see some things from, I'm an amateur genealogist, and I am literally direct descendant of the colonizers that went from the UK to the US, what is now called the US. My family were on the Mayflower. I could, if I wanted to, if I didn't think it was a horrific thing, I could join a club for all the people who were direct descendants. Some of the pictures that you'll see here are members of my family throughout hundreds of years, and including a photo of myself in the top right, which is from the year where my world shattered, where I first suffered domestic violence. And I want to talk to you a bit about how my own personal story. So my parents, both sides of my parents, European descendants, come from wealthy families, and families that were very wealthy, and they raised their children using Black women to do most of the parenting, right? And even my mother was mainly raised by people that Black women that my grandmother hired to help with everything from doing housework to breastfeeding. And that meant that my mother, at 18 years old, when she decided she hated her family and moved out into the world because she was also a victim of domestic violence at home, she had no real understanding of what being a parent was. And she and my father come from similar backgrounds, and they brought me into the world as teenagers. So they didn't physically harm me, the domestic violence that I personally experienced, some emotional abuse from my family, but it was mainly from partners of my mother, that she had a cycle where she, for decades, went through from partner to partner, as we all know that can happen, that abused her in the same way that she was at home when she was a kid. But she worked incredibly, incredibly hard to get us into a better position. Our family completely cut my mother and my parents off. My mother saw the reason that we were suffering, the reason that violence was happening against us, and the reason that she couldn't kind of pull herself together is because of poverty. But in the end, it wasn't poverty. It was this entrapment of intergenerational trauma, including the fact that she couldn't and wouldn't accept the biases and the lens of the oppressor mentality that fed all the way into her life and then down to me and my sister. When I was a teenager, I decided I was going to be the first member of my family to break this cycle. I didn't want to suffer. I didn't want to be with someone who was going to beat me or harm me, and I didn't want to harm other people. So against everything my family wanted, I began therapy. And they were angry. They didn't understand what or why I was doing it. I worked with this amazing therapist who took a very holistic approach, and they wanted me to understand how the history of my family affected where I was, how the biases that I had and the way that I looked at my parents, but also looked at other people, caused me to have reactions as a way to guard myself and protect my inner child, but weren't serving me as I grew up. And that person was this amazing human being who basically saved me from a lifetime of suffering, but also helped me forgive my parents and put me on the right track of becoming someone who constantly worked on decentering themselves in spaces that should be safe for other people. I'll get into more of that in a second. Next slide, please. So because of what I've described here, I suffer from both oppressor and oppressed person generational trauma. My skin color, my income, my education, I have huge amounts of privilege. My gender and the fact that I'm disabled and chronically ill also make me vulnerable to harm and discrimination. Both of those things exist at the same time, and both are true. So recognizing that I come from this line of people who did horrible things, and I've inherited the trauma of their violence, as well as the fact that I am often subjected to harm because of my disabilities in particular and my gender, it's important that I recognize both of those pieces of me exist, and I engage with the world through a lens of healing on both sides of that coin. I need to build relationships with communities that reflect the values of fairness, empathy, and justice. I need to seek out and create my own family, and I do this actively, that is working on themselves in the same way that I do myself. So things that I've done is I diversify my social and professional circles. I think it's way too easy to get in a bubble where we only talk to people who see things the same we do, or the same skin color as us, or same gender as us, or same able-bodiedness as us. And that is a huge mistake. And if you're going to heal, you have to break through those barriers. Now, don't tokenize people. Don't tokenize Black women saying, I got to have a Black female friend, so I'm going to go and find a Black female to be friends with. But look for situations, look for book clubs or opportunities to just get different perspective and make your social circle and your career circle wider and broader, because as soon as you do that, you begin to heal. I promise you, that is one of the first steps to healing. I learned how to listen. It was a huge difficulty because I'm very gobby and I'm a white woman who probably centers herself too much. But I took a lot of education, a lot of courses on active listening, and I also have learned from anti-racism educators about how to actively listen and to really absorb what's being said to me and taught to me by Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other people of color, as well as disabled people and people who are impoverished. And what I've learned through this listening progress is I don't know very much. I'm still always learning. But also, when I do talk, when it's my turn, I need to know how to accept criticism, because I'm going to get things wrong. So one of the best things I've done to heal myself, especially on the oppressor generational trauma side, is taking on criticism without defensiveness, taking on criticism without centering the fact that I should know everything because I'm the most privileged person in the room, and not immediately responding to criticism. I sit with it, I reflect on it, I acknowledge what I've done wrong, and then I figure out how I can change and do things differently. And I genuinely believe if my parents, my parents' parents, or going back many generations, had just learned these basic social skills and these things that are really important to find equity in the world, I wouldn't have had to go through all the things I did when I was a child. So next slide, please. So some practical strategies that have helped me and that I think will help you. And when I say you, I'm speaking to the other phenotypically white people in the room on your journey to healing your oppressor trauma. So firstly, and I mentioned this earlier, it's always focusing on impact over intent. It absolutely does not matter what your intentions are in any situation that you're in. It's what the impact of what you said. So if you say something and it harms, if I say something and it harms Leah or Rose right now, and my intention was actually to be positive, but it hurts them, it upsets them, and they take issue with what I said, that impact is what matters more. And as the person who took those actions, it is up to me to make amends. And you don't just apologize. Apologies without accountability and action are meaningless. Do you know how many members of my family have apologized over the year for the enslaved people that they quote unquote owned? And made up stories to romanticize all of it. Those sorries, those apologies are absolutely meaningless. It's only through making amends and paying reparations and changing the cycle of violence that's gone through my family for generations that we're going to get anywhere there. So apologies, you have to require accountability. You have to take responsibility. You have to listen, and you must show that you're making those amends. And another key point is when you're responding to criticism, please don't use the word but. Try to take the word but out of your vernacular. I get what you're saying, but, or I didn't mean that, but. Like, it's a defense mechanism, especially privileged people use this defense mechanism too much, and it prevents you from truly hearing the other person and what they're trying to tell you. And lastly, and the most important part, is educate yourself. You need to read books. You need to watch lots of videos, go to events like this, listen to Black and brown educators who talk about systemic racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, and pay them for their work. And this is something that I say and people bristle a lot, but I go and do sessions like this on a variety of topics, and I don't expect to be paid for it because this is something that I'm doing as part of my anti-racism journey and also my journey to just make amends. But there are a lot of people out there who educate online and social media in events like this for free, and they should be being paid for the education they're providing us because it's the harm we did that have forced them to take these positions in life. So if you've got a favorite social media influencer or an author or somebody that you've taken a course with, find a way to compensate them for their work because they deserve it. They've done way, way more hard work, and they're more expert on whiteness and racism than we can ever be. So what we can do as white people is recognize we'll never be the experts on this, but we can become accomplices to Black liberation by doing the work ourselves and within ourselves. And we can also create safe spaces for white people to help each other through this and create community. Without doing any of that, we will never break the cycle of generational trauma that has been passed down from our ancestors who were, for the most part, terrible people. That's it. That's for me.
Thank you, Julie. Wow, yes. As everyone is giving lots of hearts and a round of applause. And I personally am so proud of everything that you've just said. So White Women Alliance is one of the charities that I also work very closely with. And we have had lots of these conversations. And being able to put your story, your personal story into words and articulate that for an audience, I think is really, really powerful because we're seeing the manifestation of you breaking the cycle. We're seeing that when you have access and you actually take time to educate, we can break cycles of domestic abuse, of intergenerational trauma, and the impact on ACEs. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for being brave enough to share. And thank you for all of the time and education you've invested in yourself, but also then allowing us and the audience to be able to witness in real time what breaking the cycle can do, which goes back to reiterate how important the work of White Women Alliance and For Baby's Sake is, because there will be more equity if we can have more individuals like yourself being open and willing to educate and put your hand up and say, my family did wrong. The answer, but I want to break this cycle. So yes, thank you very much. We are now about to move into our Q&A session, if anyone does have any questions. But I would also like to say, whilst we're waiting for any of those to pop up in the chat box, that today, the information that has been shared, it may, as Julie mentioned in her section, it may well be that it's emotionally activating for you. So please do make sure you take some time to ground yourself, sit with your thoughts, and be able to work through them so that you're not carrying any energy that can be detrimental to the rest of your day or to the others that you're interacting. If you need any additional support, please do reach out to For Baby's Sake or myself. We'll be more than happy to support or signpost you, or even if it's for educational purposes. You have been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much. Yes, Daisy, do we have any questions in the Q&A?
We do. Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to everyone who's put comments in the chat box. It's been so heartening to see the response, the very emotive response to the information that we've received today. We do have one question from the Rosebud Centre who ask, and I think it's directed to Julie, can you please talk a bit more about why descendants continue to perpetuate harm despite seeing the impact? I wonder if this will have some parallels with the harm done in domestic situations.
I think it is not only parallel to what happens, the harm that's done in domestic situations, but I think it's absolutely caused by and or correlated by. On a personal level, and from what I've witnessed, I grew up very with a lot of people that are in a very diverse neighborhood, and I don't know a single kid from that neighborhood who wasn't subjected to ACEs or witnessed lots of violence. And one of the things that I strongly believe is that when our ancestors own other people, when our ancestors police other people and treat them as subhuman, they also do that within the bounds of their homes. So children were treated like property, wives were treated like incubators, and violence was the only answer to problems going generation after generation. And I don't even know how to separate the two things in my mind. To me, it would be really hard for me to talk about the violence that I experienced in my life without talking about my ancestors. Now, other people may not experience ACEs, but still come from the same background as me. But there may be other harm and violence that you enact or is enacted upon you. Any white person that says they're not racist isn't facing up to their internalized racism, or that they're not ableist and they're healthy, then they're not facing up to that. We commit microaggressions against people of color all the time, and we don't make amends from it because our ancestors and even ourselves and our parents have never believed that we had to. So it's up to us to break that cycle. I'm not sure if I fully answered that right. But.
That was a brilliant answer. Thank you so much, Julie. I've got a question from someone called Lisa who shares a really troubling experience when she describes, why can't Black people present as English? When I told a white colleague that I'm English, she just laughed and told me I'm not English because of my race. I don't know if anyone had anything to...
I can jump in on that one.
Yeah, thanks.
Again, that's something I've also experienced. And even to this day, I'm currently in the Caribbean at the moment. And it's something that I also get from Jamaican people. They will say the same to me. You can't be English, you're Black. Yes, Black people can absolutely be English. English identity refers to nationality or cultural affiliation rather than race. For example, I've always referred to myself as British because I have a British passport. I was born in England. I remain British. I was, however, born in England, not necessarily Great Britain, because you're only born in one area. I was born in Cambridge. That's definitely in England. Many Black people in the UK were born there, grew up there. in British culture, and Englishness is not restricted by ethnicity. And I think that's where some people become unstuck. Then they're just unsure. It encompasses a diverse range of people, including those that are African, Caribbean, Asian, and other heritage backgrounds. The concept of being English is slowly, but it is evolving to include, or be more inclusive, I should say, of multicultural identities. Unfortunately, there is still lots of work to be done. Black British communities have really deep roots within the UK. So my parents are part of the Windrush generation. However, so they wouldn't be classed as English. I am. My children are. And it's distinguishing the difference there, I think. Yes, both my parents have British passports, but they're not English. They didn't grow, they weren't born and grown and raised in English with the English culture and values. Whereas it's quite ironic, I now feel a bit like an outsider in the Caribbean because half of them see me as English, British, and half of them see me as Black Caribbean, but from the small islands. So it's the simplicity of people's mindset. And if you're Black, you're born in England, Asian, it doesn't matter. If you're born in England, you are essentially English. Whether or not someone likes it, it doesn't deter the fact that you are. I am never going to say I am Thai, for example. Even if I obtained the sufficient documentation, I will never be Thai because I don't know the culture. I didn't grow up. I wasn't born there. And I think that's the key definition between the two that distinguishes whether or not you can be deemed English. At the end of the day, the land belongs to people. It's just been monopolized through the past traumas that still impact us today. And it just shows how it continues to transcend through generations and the simplicity of people's mindsets. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was so thorough and a really brilliant response. We are over time now, but I think I would just love to share a couple of comments, even if not questions. Stephanie said, this is one of the best, most thoughtful webinar I've attended in a while. Thank you so much. And we had a wonderful comment from Patrick that says, excellent point on creating safe spaces for white people, thinking about impact and not intent. I'm so proud of you, Julie, for sharing your personal story and bringing your family into this session. You have been the voice my ancestors were waiting for. I think that could be a really lovely way to wrap up.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attendance.
I'm triggered by all of this at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your comments still coming in. We will be sending around the recording and the slides from this session. If you do have any questions for any of the speakers, their details are included on the slides. Thank you so much for your time today. Leah, any closing comments?
No, just to finish off with a huge thank you. You've all been absolutely wonderful, really engaged, and it really does help us on the other side. And please continue to ask questions. Please remain inquisitive. You don't have to become experts in culture or anything like that. You just have to be compassionate and informed enough to ask questions. Thank you all.